Okay, I think we're ready to go. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Prairie Places, a look at community pastures. My name is Kayla Burak, and I am the Engagement Manager for the Saskatchewan region at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I will be your moderator today. I'd like to start by stating that we at the Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledge that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is a national charity and Canada's leading not-for-profit private land conservation organization working to protect our most important natural areas and the species they sustain. Since 1962, NCC and its partners have helped to protect 14 million hectares or 35 million acres coast to coast to coast. To learn more, visit our website at www.natureconservancy.ca. We'll be joined today by three of our NCC speakers. Rebecca Neufeld, Acting Conservation Science Manager for the Manitoba region. Matthew Braun, Manager of Conservation Science and Planning for the Saskatchewan region. And Krista Ellingson, Contractor and Range Management Specialist for the Saskatchewan region. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping topics. As we are being joined by people from across the country, you may experience a temporary glitch during the live stream. We thank you in advance for your patience. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be sharing a link to the recording after the event, so keep an eye on your inbox. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues, friends, and family. We want you to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts with our online community. Feel free to connect with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using hashtag NCC NatureTalks during and after the webinar. We also invite your comments and questions. You will notice a Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, just type it in there. Include who the question is intended for, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rebecca Neufeld, Acting Conservation Science Manager for the Manitoba region. Rebecca Neufeld graduated from Brandon University with a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and a major in Botany, and has over 10 years of fieldwork experience. She has worked at NCC in various stewardship, science, and engagement capacities since 2011, and has past experience conducting field research in Churchill and Southern Manitoba as a research assistant at Brandon University. Rebecca leads and coordinates the landscape scale planning and monitoring activities of NCC Manitoba's 10 natural area conservation plans and manages the region's natural area-based science and research initiatives. The floor is all yours, Rebecca.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start off with a very short intro to community pastures and a few reasons why NCC cares so much about community pastures in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So to start, what is a community pasture? So very briefly, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, community pastures refer to lands that were previously set aside and managed to combat soil erosion in the 1920s and 30s. They include many of the lands managed by the federal government beginning in 1935 as part of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration Act program. These lands encompass over 1.1 million hectares across 144 pastures. Through this program, knowledge about the importance and value of native grasses and managing these fragile ecosystems increased, and the management of them evolved to consider not only productive rangelands, but also the maintenance of a healthy landscape that supported functioning prairie ecosystems. The federal government has since divested of the lands, and these pastures are now largely cared for by local and provincial community groups. So why are they so important from a conservation and ecological perspective? In short, these relatively large, intact blocks of habitat are becoming increasingly rare. But more specifically, it is because of the amazing and diverse ecosystems and wildlife that they sustain, and their role as some of the most important strongholds of biodiversity and natural areas in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. These pastures support approximately 195 species of significance, including dozens that are considered species at risk. So as you can imagine, as areas used primarily to support livestock, many of these pastures support significant tracts of grasslands. Native prairie and grasslands are one of the most endangered and least protected ecosystems in the world, and they continue to be lost in Canada and around the world. Many of the species that depend on them are declining or considered at risk, and in Manitoba and Saskatchewan especially, what is left is becoming increasingly fragmented. In these areas, community pastures represent some of the last remaining large and continuous blocks of native grasslands, and their continued existence is largely due to the previous and current management of these lands as both pasture for livestock and for the important biodiversity and ecosystem services. So these large unbroken prairie expanses are critically important habitat for threatened and endangered grassland birds. They support at-risk prairie plants, butterflies, and reptiles, and other species that need wide open space to roam, like pronghorn, elk, and mule deer. These grasslands are a haven for insects and pollinators that are seeing declines worldwide, yet are still incredibly important for our food production and productivity of our ecosystems. In Manitoba in particular, the tallgrass prairie ecosystem found across a number of these lands has been designated as an endangered ecosystem by the province. However, the prairies are actually only just a part of the incredible and critically important biodiversity found on these pastures. In some areas, sand dunes shift in the wind and are home to a host of specially adapted insects and plants. In others, you may find rare ecosystems such as alvar, a harsh landscape where only a few centimeters of soil atop flat limestone bedrock support an unusual mix of species, some of them specially adapted to these very particular conditions. Additionally, these large tracts of land support numerous wetlands and streams, providing important habitat for wildlife while also filtering and storing the water that we all depend on. Marshes and ephemeral ponds across the prairies and parklands host waterbirds and waterfowl and support species at risk, amphibians like leopard frogs, and birds like the piping plover. In some places, you can find peat fens, rare calcareous marl pools, and petrified springs that bring a sense of otherworldliness and a host of diverse species and wildlife habitat. Freshwater springs flow year-round, replenishing our creeks and rivers and providing clean water for people and wildlife alike, while also supporting rare plants and insects. So in many cases, these pasture lands are often endless open expanses, full of hidden treasures that are tucked amongst seas of grasses and in hidden valleys. However, many also support important forest habitat. Riparian forests along river valleys and streams represent important connectivity and migratory pathways for all sorts of wildlife. They also buffer our waterways, slowing spring melt and mitigating flood risk, and protect sensitive soils from erosion. Large and small patches of forest alike support breeding at-risk birds such as the eastern wood pewee and provide habitat stepping stones for species migrating during the spring and the fall. So these habitat and ecosystems I touched on are just a small snapshot and barely scratch the surface of the amazing biodiversity that these lands represent. Their ecological value is immense and is only compounded by their importance to people. As areas of climate change resilience for the filtration and replenishment of our drinking water, in support of pollinators for our crops, a site of historical, societal and cultural significance, important carbon storage, and as keystones of our livestock and food production industries, and for their role as part of a way of life for people who live and work in and around them. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our talk.
Thank you, Rebecca. We appreciate you providing your insights on the importance of pastures in the prairie landscapes. Next up, we have Matthew Braun, Manager of Conservation Science and Planning for the Saskatchewan region. Matthew Braun is a University of Saskatchewan College of Agriculture graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and a Master's of Science and 15 years of experience as a professional agrologist working in range management. As an agrologist, Matthew has worked with ranchers and other resource managers across British Columbia and Saskatchewan, monitoring the impacts of livestock grazing to balance competing resource uses. Matthew's role within NCC is to facilitate the development and implementation of NCC Saskatchewan's 11 natural area conservation plans and work with researchers interested in exploring prairie parkland ecology. Take it away, Matt.
And I think I'm on mute. Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Great.
Yes.
Great, and hello folks. My name is Matthew Braun, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the successes of community pastures, how they work to form an important part of our economies and societies in the prairies, and how things changed over time, and then how NCC worked in its expertise and opportunities to work with those community pastures, and what we're doing in the future here. So the first part of it was the community pastures were very successful because of the professional management of those pastures. There was the individual pasture managers were professionally trained, continuously trained, and there was a structure in place to monitor some of those other ecosystem processes that Rebecca was mentioning in her presentation there. There were people that would come out and monitor for those and ensure that they were balancing all the uses there. What the result of that was there was a high quality forage for the livestock industry, which helped diversify local economies where those community pastures were. And it also gave a good sense of identity to those communities. They had something a little different in their communities. In 2012, when the federal government chose to announce the end of the community pasture program, and in 2017, when Saskatchewan started to end its similar program, there was an emphasis change in the way those pastures were managed, and some of the supports around them were changed, and that was an opportunity for NCC to look at how we might be involved in the future of supporting those long-term goals of those pastures. One of the things that NCC has been doing in the prairies for the last 40-ish years is doing the seeking out high-valued biodiversity lands and purchasing those ones at fee simple properties, as well as signing conservation agreements, where we're focusing on purchasing lands and signing agreements that are of high value. And in the course of doing that, we've also spent a lot of time stewarding those lands and learning how to manage for multiple values, as well as how to work with multiple different partners as well. And so when the changes in the pasture programs were announced and started to happen, we saw that those areas were still going to be there, but there was going to be some changes in how they were managed, and it might be an opportunity for NCC to use some of our expertise and some of our past experience to see where we could fit in with those existing pastures, because of course those pastures didn't go away. They're still being used and still have those same goals of long-term sustainability, but we wanted to see how we might fit in providing some of our expertise to that, to support those similar goals. So what we did was we started a planning process called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, which is an internationally recognized planning process that allows organizations like ourselves to identify high-value targets, biodiversity targets mostly in an area, but also see how they're associated with human well-being targets as well. Identify those high-value targets, and then start looking at what are some of the stressors on those targets, and kind of rank them from most severe to least severe as objectively as possible. And then this helps us kind of understand what the situation is and what are the different factors that impact the pastures and all of the different values that are out there. This exercise in conceptualizing what's going on out there really helps us focus in on where our expertise and our abilities are best used, which allows us to generate really specific and measurable goals that can be monitored over time and then reevaluated over time. And so we went through this process with a pretty tight team of experts and engaged stakeholders within our organization, but we also reached out to as many different interested organizations as we could to talk about what their values were, what their perspective on the situation was, and just really tried to nail down where best NCC could be involved. And in that process, we really did also try and include some sense of that broader Indigenous perspective that would help give a broader perspective on how to manage all of the values on those pastures, and how NCC could be involved in helping out with those values. And in the course of that time, we also we did come up with an NCC plan for how we would work with pastures. And there was 13 large strategies there that really focused in on building trust with people that are using the pastures, the ranchers, the hunters, the nature viewers, indigenous people looking for medicinal plants and cultural sites, how best we could use our expertise to help support the ongoing ecological integrity of those pastures. And we really wanted to also, we saw a need there also to raise awareness in the general public on what the pastures are, that they're still out there, and how important they really are, so that they could really still be a long-term part of our society, of our environment for time immemorial. And one of the things, as we continued on with that process, we developed a pilot program that was looking to work with specific pastures and support different agencies working with pastures in Saskatchewan and Manitoba to do holistic assessments of pastures, so we could really get a good sense of all the different things going on the ground, which would help us help develop customized plans, management plans that the pasture managers could use to implement strategies for balancing all those different values out there. And then really wanted to see if we could add to some of that training that was maybe not happening anymore, to see if there was an opportunity for us to help provide networks for the pasture managers and their boards and the different associations that are involved there, to really try and continue on that good education that they had been doing before. And then again, we saw a role for NCC to play in promoting the importance of pastures throughout Canada, so that people really understood how important these lands can be. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kayla.
Thanks, Matt, for sharing your experience with NCC's approach to supporting prairie pastures. Our final speaker today is Krista Ellingson, Range Management Specialist and Contractor with NCC Saskatchewan. Krista works at the intersection of conservation and agriculture by supporting range management planning and conservation initiatives in Saskatchewan pastures. As an agrologist, biologist, and occasional pasture writer, she provides a unique perspective on how we can steward native rangelands together. Whenever you're ready, Krista.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right, so as Matthew mentioned, NCC has been working with community pastures for the past several years to encourage conservation and support sustainable grazing management. These pastures are a place where diverse and resilient natural systems and human activity coexist. My role has been to provide on-the-ground support and information to community pastures to help them make good management decisions. Each summer, I visit community pastures and walk hundreds of kilometers learning about how the landscape is working. I've always wanted to take someone with me while I'm exploring these places, and today's my chance. So make sure that you close the gate behind you and let's go for a hike. The foundation of the work that I do in community pastures is the range health assessment. I get to know the current health of the plant community and get a better understanding of how cattle are using any particular area. At the same time, I keep my eye out for all the different wildlife and plant species that might be there. You can think of it as being sort of like a rapid baseline inventory. Some of the species that I find are really common, and occasionally I find something quite rare, but they all contribute to a diverse and resilient natural system. So the first place that I'd like to visit with you today is the dry mixed grass prairie of southwest Saskatchewan. There's different areas in this field that have different soil types and different resulting vegetation communities. Each part of the field is going to be evaluated based on how similar it is to what would be expected in a perfectly healthy system with similar soil. In a field like this, I would probably spend all day. I'd start in those loamy uplands you can see in the background, and then move on to the thinner soil types in the steeper hills. In the mid-ground, you can see some sagebrush flecked flats, and those would all be assessed separately as well. That soil there is a little bit more clayey and salty. And then a third area in this field that would have to be assessed separately would be the riparian area along the river that runs through the middle. By completing range health assessments, NCC and the partner pasture now have a starting point for discussions about management goals going forward. So let's have a quick look at a site with slightly clayey, salty soils. In this example, cattle do have access, but that access has been really well managed. The plant community is what I'd expect to see in a healthy rangeland. There's northern and western wheatgrass, needle and thread, green needlegrass, and you can see a high density of silver sagebrush. Vegetation from last year's growth has fallen to the ground and creates a layer of litter that protects the soil surface from erosion. To me, this site looks like really good wintering habitat for the endangered greater sage grouse. This past summer, in a site similar to the one that we just looked at, I found a new to me plant. This is silvery lupine, and it's considered very rare in Saskatchewan. It's more common in the cypress uplands, but once in a while, you can get lucky and find it in dry mixed grass prairie. Not very far away from the sagebrush flat, there's a river running through, and this river runs year round. A riffle forms a natural crossing point for white-tailed deer and cattle. Community pastures are more than just grass. They're rivers, springs, and wetlands. These natural water bodies provide a water source for cattle and wildlife and need to be carefully managed to avoid damage to them. In the background, you can see some thorny buffaloberry shrubs. These shrubs are perfect nesting habitat for a threatened species, the loggerhead shrike. Loggerhead shrikes are well known for their habit of impaling their prey on the thorns of buffaloberry. Unlike the previous field, this field is a vast stretch of a single soil type, and so it's a little less complicated from a grazing management perspective. In this gently rolling upland, there is a wide diversity of grassland songbirds. These spots are some of my very favorite because they have become so rare in Saskatchewan, with most of it having been cultivated for annual crop production. There's gradients in litter accumulation and grazing pressure across the field, and that's what creates different habitats for so many different species of songbird. I'm going to play a recording now, so you might have to adjust the volume a little bit on your computer. I'd like you to hear what a field like this might sound like on a morning in June. There's the bobolink, grasshopper sparrow, cow moving in the background, western meadowlark, striped pipit, here's a Savannah sparrow, there's Barrett sparrow, and that's just at one spot for a few seconds. If you were walking through these pastures all day, you'd find many more species. Domestic livestock aren't the only species grazing in these pastures. You could find mule deer, white-tailed deer, pronghorn, moose, and elk. In some of the pastures, if you had a really good day, you might manage to spot all 5 species. These really large blocks of native prairie are divided into fields to manage grazing. These fields can range in size from a few quarters to several sections. And while the fence does loom large in this picture, we're going to have to walk several miles before we come across another fence line. From here, let's head west across the rolling upland grassland. So a few miles to the west, we're going to come to a spot where the flat prairie falls away into a rolling coulee. You can imagine you might see a big mule deer buck bouncing over the ridge, and in the bottom of the coulee there's a creek that's spring fed and runs year round. If it's a calm morning and it's not too hot, we might hear a rock wren singing from a jumble of rocks over on the side of the coulee. These coulee slopes are vegetated by creeping juniper, few-flowered buckwheat, sedges, June grass, needle and thread grass, and pasture sage. Common nighthawk, a threatened species, nests on these rugged coulee slopes. I cheated a little bit in this picture and took the picture of the nighthawk sitting on a post. But when they're on the ground in their natural nesting habitat, they blend in perfectly to the bare soil. So let's move a few hundred kilometers north and east. Now we're on a totally different piece of native grass in a different community pasture. Here, there are extremely sandy soils and partially stabilized sand dunes, and that's what's driving the mix of wildlife and plant species here. These soils are really sensitive to disturbance, but some disturbance is needed to maintain open sand habitat for some rare species. The slopes are vegetated by needle and threadgrass, sandgrass, sand dropseed, creeping juniper. The trembling aspen can be found in some of the moister low spots. In the far distance, you can see a strip of shrubs. This is marking where a river runs on the edge of the pasture. This river is teeming with northern leopard frogs, a species of special concern. Northern leopard frogs use both natural water bodies and dugouts intended for livestock watering. If we were to walk across or along the banks of this river, we'd hear a whole bunch of plops as the frogs jump out of the way to clear a path for us. As we move away from the river, the sandy hills get bigger and steeper, and there's more exposed sand. If you made it this far before midday, you might notice a bright burst of purple along the edge of a sandy ridge. What you're seeing is western spiderwort, a threatened species. This community pasture is home to it's likely the largest population of western spiderwort in Canada. These bold, showy flowers fade quickly in the heat, and what's left is their grassy vegetation, which is really hard to pick out from the sand dunes. So if we were walking together across all these sandy meadows and steep sand dunes, I think you'd quickly notice something that's a little bit out of place. What you might spot is leafy spurge, which you can see here in the foreground and scattered along the sand dune. While it might not look like it's a huge problem in this picture with just a few plants, if left unmanaged, it can create solid, dense stands that will forever change wildlife habitat and have negative impacts on habitat for rare plants. It's well established in this part of Saskatchewan, and it is a serious threat to western spiderwort. People have a role to play in the good management of community pastures. Grazing is an important part of this system, and the actions of people are needed to mitigate potential threats to the native prairie. With our partner Pastures, we're learning together how to best manage threats to native prairie. Here, one of the pasture groups has organized a day to share what they've learned with their neighbors and with other community pastures about how to manage leafy spurge invasion. In the background, you can see a herd of sheep and goats that are heavily grazing the leafy spurge to control it. People rely on community pastures as a place to include livestock in their farming operations. There's families that live and work at community pastures. The delicate balance between grazing and biodiversity conservation can exist without the intentional effort of the people making management decisions. The people that rely on these pastures are fiercely protective of them, and with support, good information, and resources, I think they make really strong partners in conservation. So now we've walked quite far, and you've had a chance to see a little bit about what I've seen in 2 of the community pastures that we're working with. It's important to recognize that these are some of the largest, healthiest pieces of native prairie left. By working together with community pastures, NCC is ensuring that the focus remains on sustainable use and conserving biodiversity. Thanks for coming with me today.
Thank you, Krista. We're grateful to you for your time today and for sharing your firsthand experience working on prairie pastures. We have several questions for the speakers that have been submitted by the audience. As a reminder, if you have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it using the Q&A chat box feature. Let us know who the question is for, and we will get through as many as time allows. Okay. Just going to go to the questions here. There's lots of great questions coming in. Let's start with a couple broad ones. Are pastures just found in Manitoba and Saskatchewan? I'm going to make this a two-parter. And how many and how large in total are there in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, if you happen to know some rough numbers offhand?
Yeah, so it's a bit more complicated than maybe we initially presented. There are several different pasture programs in each of the different provinces. So Manitoba mostly had federally run community pastures. Saskatchewan had federally run community pastures as well as provincially run community pastures, and then something called grazing co-ops, which was slightly different. Alberta had a system of grazing reserves, which is again a little bit different. And then BC has another system of community pastures which was a different beast altogether as well. So there's different allotted lands and different programs supporting those lands in each of the different provinces. We chose to focus on the federally run, the former federal pastures in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the numbers, I think Rebecca gave those in her original presentation of 144, I think, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.1 million hectares of land.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.
Along the same kind of lines, what is your ecological range health approach to monitoring and stewardship of the community pasture landscape, recognizing biodiversity, economic, and ecological goods and services needs? That's a big question. I don't know, Krista, do you want to help tackle that?
I can talk a little bit about the range health component. So when I'm out there, I'm using the standard PCAP protocol for assessing range health. So I'm looking at a specific vegetation community and comparing it to how it should look compared to our reference community. Because I'm out there and I'm on the ground walking, I try to also at the same time keep track of what diversity of wildlife and other plants are on the landscape. So that part of the process is a little less formal, but I've still managed to collect quite a bit of information about what's out there. Once I've done a range health assessment, it's summarized and presented to the groups managing the pasture, and then we work together to see if there's things that they're doing that might need improvement or if they're headed in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Rebecca or Matthew, how often does NCC visit and assess each pasture in Saskatchewan? And is this data provided to the stakeholders in the pasture?
Yeah, so the Saskatchewan programs and the Manitoba programs differed slightly in our approach. We looked in Saskatchewan. We were dealing with a few specific individual pastures, and we did an assessment that was the assessment that Chris was referring to and that she walked us through is essentially typically done on a 5-year or 10-year basis to assess kind of long-term changes. So we visited those pastures at the beginning of our program, and there's an opportunity to do that again. And the information gathered from that, including the information that Krista mentioned, the species observations, those were all kind of tied into a package that we presented to the pasture managers and their boards, and it was tied into work we did with them to help develop grazing management plans, so that they have access to all that information, and it helps make decisions a little bit easier, or provide some information for those decision-making processes. And Rebecca's about ready to talk about the Manitoba context there. I'll let her do that.
Yeah, in Manitoba, we are a little less directly involved in some of that data collection. So in Manitoba, the Association of Manitoba Community Pastures manage much of the lands, and they do a lot of this work themselves. And NCC's role here in Manitoba is more to provide support to their organization in completing that work and supporting them as opposed to us doing some of the work themselves. So in that case, they most certainly do have the data. And any work that we would do with them, that's other types of monitoring or surveys, would always be done in partnership, and that data would be theirs.
Great, thank you. We have a couple species-specific questions here, which is kind of neat. How does the management of community pastures affect, well, the question says kit fox conservation, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that they maybe swift fox were maybe meant. And is sagebrush a native plant?
So yes, silver sagebrush is native in the system that I was showing you. It's an important species for greater sage grouse. A couple of the pastures that we're working with do have habitat for swift fox, and we know where in the pastures those species typically occur, and that information is shared with the pasture managers. In the case of swift fox, it's actually usually the pasture manager that spots them, and that's the reason why we know exactly where they're at. The manager will make any management decisions that he thinks are necessary to protect their habitat, but for the most part, grazing is really compatible with swift fox conservation.
Great, thank you, Krista. Maybe another question for you, Krista. How do you manage for badgers and prairie dogs?
Badgers are always a contentious issue in community pastures because I think people have been ingrained. They think that they're worried about the holes that they create. But now that people are aware that they are experiencing population declines, the people involved in community pastures are working to protect them. So we do see badgers at quite a few different community pastures. Prairie dogs are not present in any of the pastures where we're currently working, but there are some community pastures that have prairie dog populations.
Great, thank you. Maybe a question for Matthew. Are bison used to maintain community pastures?
Ooh, another contentious question. No, there are, as far as I know, no bison on community pastures. NCC owns a herd of bison. We have a herd of bison at one of our ranches in southwest Saskatchewan, and they are certainly a useful tool in some contexts for managing grasslands. And the bison industry in the prairies has certainly expanded considerably in the last number of years. And so there are a number of herds of bison grazing on native prairie, but none of them are grazing on community pastures as far as I know.
Great, thank you. I got a great question here for you, Krista. What is your favorite pasture and why?
I'm going to have to answer that it's the one that I live at. I get to see it every day, and it's the one that I know most intimately. This community pasture isn't one that's working directly with NCC, but I'm here all the time, and I've gotten to know every field. I have little favorite spots, favorite wetlands, favorite jumbles of rocks where my kids play. So I really love this place.
That's great. I love that. Question for Rebecca. Does the plan include purchasing the pastures from the provincial government and from the RMs? Maybe that's help. Matthew can help as well, depending.
So the securement or protection of lands is something that NCC, does keep in mind. That's not something we would ever, consider or do without, an interest and from the groups or managing the lands. NCC has no plan to purchase any of these lands at all, but may have an interest in helping to secure land through some sort of mechanism that would ensure long-term protection of the pasture lands. So it's something we do think about, but as Matthew talked about before, our focus in this work is really to support and work with and partner the groups who are already managing these lands, as opposed to having a focus on securement.
Great. Another question for you, Rebecca. How do you manage an area with invasive plant species starting to expand into the native grassland and starting to reduce some of the native grasses and forb densities?
Complicated question. It's going to vary a lot depending on where you are, the type of species and the type of impacts it might have. So as Krista mentioned, some management activities could include using species or domestic animals such as sheep who will graze, and if managed in a certain way can be appropriate. As they do get into some of those native systems with those sensitive species or significant species, it does get a lot more complicated as we have to kind of balance that with it. So controls that NCC uses, which may not necessarily be the case, as these community pastures are not managed by us, but many control activities can include, compatible grazing activities. As Krista mentioned, the use of chemical control, which again would vary widely depending on where you are, what the species was, and what other context was considered in the area. Mechanical control could also be used. So, sorry, not a very specific answer, but it wildly varies depending on what kind of species you're considering, and a lot of other factors you have to consider before you use any of those methods. And again, NCC does not directly manage the land, so a lot of this would come down to the pasture manager's decisions.
Thanks, Rebecca. Question for Matthew: are all community pastures grazed?
Oh, good question. So this is something I'm learning more and more about with more of the pastures that we're meeting. So the pastures that we're working with, most of them include at least a little bit of hayland as well. So depending on, again, the program in place, some of those pastures had a stock of bulls to provide for the producers bringing their livestock there, and they required some hayland as well. So there was generally some haying. So that's harvesting forage, mechanically harvesting forage and putting it up and storing it for use during the winter. So a lot of the pastures include some hayland, and those generally are not grazed. And every pasture also generally has some area that they're resting on any given year. So they're very careful to manage the resources they have, and to provide the different fields some opportunity to go an entire year without being grazed as well. But as far as I know, most of the community pastures have a board in place that with the purpose of raising livestock on those lands, and again managing those lands properly for long-term continued use.
Great, thanks, Matthew. Question for Krista: are there any pastures using migratory grazing in their management plans?
I don't think there's any pastures right now that would call it migratory grazing, at least not any of the ones that I'm working with. They do utilize some of the drift tendencies that are already inherent in cattle to help target certain spots of different fields, and use different cattle in specific fields with a plan to use that natural tendency to achieve their management objectives. So there's cross fence in all of the community pastures that we're working with, and the rotations are usually planned in advance and use cross fence to organize that.
Great, thanks, Krista. Question for Rebecca: where in Manitoba are the community pastures located?
So they're scattered across southern Manitoba, so kind of agro Manitoba primarily, and they're really kind of all across. I think I briefly shown a map earlier, but yeah, I'm not sure what a better answer is, but they're kind of spotted kind of east to west across Manitoba where there's rangelands. So that includes a lot of our prairie areas, but as mentioned before, we do have lands that have a lot of forest, wetland, and other communities kind of closer to the boreal regions. So really scattered all across. So yeah, I'm not sure if I have if that was a great answer, but there's definitely, if you pop around online, you might be able to get some more information about kind of specific locales where they are. But yeah, they're kind of scattered all across.
Great, thank you. Question 4, Matthew, where are there some of these pastures in Saskatchewan now? I used to be aware of the many PFRA pastures, but those no longer exist, correct?
So as we mentioned in our presentations, though those programs that supported the pastures have ended, but the lands didn't go anywhere. They're still where they were, and they're still being used as best as possible. And similar to Rebecca's answer, they are scattered all through Saskatchewan from pretty much every corner, right up into the boreal transition as well. So there's pastures all over the place, and the signs may have come down, but those pastures are still there, and still providing those same benefits to the communities. And yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have one final question here, maybe for both Matthew and Rebecca. I'll let Matthew answer first. Leafy spurge is a huge problem across the landscape. Do you have a plan to reduce the spurge, like what is being done in Elbow, using sheep and goats?
I think Krista and I can give that one a tackle there. I think the Elbow example has been very interesting. It's a very serious problem at the Elbow pasture, and they've been very progressive in trying to tackle it. They've got a number of different fronts in which they're addressing that, and I think including some research as well and some community outreach as well. And I think those are they're implementing as many different control methods as are possible there. And I think that combined with the research and the public engagement is probably the way forward in terms of providing a model for other not just pastures, but also private landowners who are looking at this same issue, parks that are having the same problems with theirs, with that particular species. And I think that's probably going to be the way forward, is that multi-prong approach, and then let other groups know about your successes and what didn't work, so that they can learn from you. And Krista has worked quite closely with the producer group there, as well as some of the other representatives that are concerned and working on that issue. And I'm going to let her get the final word in on that.
I think Matthew summed it up well. The board there has been working with financial support from the province to put a lot of these practices into place. They do integrated weed management planning every year, and they're using a multi-pronged approach. Like Matthew said, they're using targeted herbicide application. They have leafy spurge beetle releases, and they use targeted grazing from sheep and goats. They also have a monitoring component to their plan to see if what they're doing is making positive progress, and they're open to having researchers come and learn about the problem. That, combined with sharing what they've learned with their neighbors and other people experiencing the same problem, has really, I think, been a positive example about how to manage noxious weeds.
Great, thank you. Well, that is all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get to your question, or you have something else you would like to ask any of our panelists, or have a topic request for a future webinar, please reach out to us at events@natureconservancy.ca. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Rebecca, Matthew, and Krista, thank you all for sharing your insights and expertise. For updates on future webinars and events in your area, check out our events page at www.natureconservancy.ca/events. Stay tuned for the link to today's webinar recording. You'll receive that in our follow-up email within the next 24 hours. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope to see you next time.